There is a specific kind of lost that has nothing to do with direction. You are not lost because you don't know where to go. You are lost because you no longer know who is doing the going. Something ended, and it did not just take itself when it left. It took the version of you that existed inside it. The person who woke up with a reason, the person who knew their place in the world, the person who had a story about themselves that made sense when they told it. And now that story is gone. And everyone around you is treating this like a logistical problem. Find a new direction, stay busy, focus on what's next, bounce back. As if the self were a rubber ball, as if you could simply decide to be someone again and have that be enough. But you already know it is not that simple. Because what you lost was not a chapter, it was the narrator. And you cannot write the next chapter until you understand why the narrator had to disappear. Carl Jung spent his life studying exactly this. Not recovery, not resilience, something far more precise and far more uncomfortable. The reason certain collapses happen at all, what they are correcting, and what they are trying to build in the rubble they leave behind. By the end of this video, you will understand why the collapse was not random. You will understand what the grief of the old self is actually asking you to do. And you will understand the difference between the rebuild that looks like progress and the rebuild that actually holds. Here is what no one tells you about losing who you were. The version of you that collapsed was not a mistake. It was not a failure of character or a punishment for poor decisions. It was a structure that worked until it didn't. Until it reached the point where continuing it required more of you than you actually had. Until maintaining who you were cost you the very things that made being that person worth anything. And so it fell. Most people respond to this by trying to rebuild the same structure faster. They take the same values, the same self-image, the same fundamental architecture, and they reconstruct it with new materials. New relationship, same dynamic. New job, same identity. New environment, same interior. And for a while, it holds. And then it falls again, sometimes harder than before. This is not bad luck. This is not the universe being cruel. This is a pattern Jung identified and named with a precision that should stop you in your tracks. He called it Enantiodromia, a concept he borrowed from the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus, the principle that everything, when it reaches its extreme, inevitably turns into its opposite. The person who is relentlessly strong eventually collapses into vulnerability. The person who gives everything to others eventually arrives at a point of total depletion. The person who builds their entire identity around achievement eventually finds that achievement feels like nothing. Not because they failed, because they succeeded so completely that the structure revealed its own emptiness. Enantiodromia is not a punishment. It is a correction. The psyche has a direction it is trying to move in, and when the conscious life, the roles, the identity, the persona, moves too far in one direction for too long, something inside tips the scales, forcibly, without asking permission. The collapse was not an accident. It was a course correction. And if you rebuild without understanding what it was correcting, you will simply earn the same correction again, with interest. Every major mythological tradition in human history contains the same story. A hero descends into the underworld, into the sea, into darkness. They lose everything that defined them on the surface. Their name, their power, their certainty, their companions. They face what lives in the deep, and they return, if they return, as something that could not have existed before the descent. Orpheus descends into Hades. Jonah descends into the whale. Odysseus crosses to the land of the dead. Dante descends through the circles of hell. The story changes across cultures and centuries, but the structure never does. You must go down before you can come back. Jung called this the Nekia, the night-sea journey, and he did not treat it as mythology. He treated it as psychological fact, a literal description of what happens inside the human psyche when the old self dies and the new self has not yet been born. The Nekia is not metaphor. It is the actual process of psychological transformation, and it is characterized by one thing above all others that modern culture is completely unprepared to honor. It takes time. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be optimized. It cannot be shortened through effort or intelligence or the right therapeutic framework. The descent is the work, not the thing you do before the real work begins, not the uncomfortable phase you push through to get to the rebuild. The descent itself is the process by which the next self becomes possible. Jung observed that the people who came through major collapses most transformed were not the ones who recovered fastest. They were the ones who allowed the descent to be what it was, who did not reach for the first available ladder back to the surface, who stayed in the dark long enough to let their eyes adjust. And what they found when their eyes adjusted was not a new direction. It was not a new identity waiting for them. It was something older than any identity they had ever worn. It was the question the old self had been too busy to ask. What do I actually want? Not what was expected of me, not what I was rewarded for, not what made sense given the story I was telling about myself. What do I actually want from the time I have? That question does not have a quick answer. It does not emerge on demand. It requires the silence that only the descent creates, the silence that most people flee because it is uncomfortable. And in fleeing it, they ascend back to the surface with nothing new, with only what they brought down. In the next part, we go into the grief, because the grief of the old self is not the obstacle to rebuilding. It is the first and most essential part of the work itself. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You need to grieve the person you were, not move on from them, not reframe their loss as a gift, not convert the grief into motivation or use it as fuel for the next chapter before you have finished sitting with this one. Grieve them. This is the step that bounce-back culture actively prevents, because grief is slow. Grief is unproductive. Grief does not generate content or momentum or visible signs of progress. Grief looks, from the outside, like someone who is stuck. But Jung was precise about what happens when grief is skipped. When the old self is not properly mourned, it does not disappear. It joins the unconscious. It accumulates there, alongside everything else that was never fully processed, and it operates from below, as nostalgia that destabilizes the present, as comparison that poisons new experience, as a loyalty to who you were that prevents you from becoming who you are trying to be. The person who does not grieve their old self carries them everywhere, into every new relationship as an invisible comparison, into every new environment as an unspoken set of standards, into every new version of themselves as a ghost that the new self is always being measured against and always falling short of. Grief is not weakness. Grief is the psyche's way of completing what happened, of giving the old self its proper ending, rather than simply abandoning it mid-sentence. Think about what the old self actually deserves from you. They carried you through everything that brought you here. They made the decisions, absorbed the failures, sustained the effort, endured the losses that eventually led to this collapse. They did not fail. They finished. And the least they deserve is an honest acknowledgement of what they were, what they gave, and what it cost them. This is not sentimentality. It is psychological hygiene. The cultures that understand this, that build ritual mourning into transition, that honor the ending before celebrating the beginning, produce people who carry less of the past into the future, not because they forget it, because they completed it. So before you ask what comes next, ask what needs to be honored first. The relationship that ended, the identity that dissolved, the version of the future you believed in that no longer exists. These things deserve their grief before they deserve their reframe. Give them that. And then something will shift. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but something will genuinely move. Here is the deepest reason most rebuilds fail. They are built by the wrong architect. Jung made a distinction that most people never encounter and that changes everything when they do. The distinction between the ego and the self. The ego is not the villain of this story. The ego is the part of you that navigates daily life, that organizes experience, makes decisions, constructs and maintains the identity you present to the world. The ego is necessary, but it is not the whole of who you are, not even close. The self, as Jung defined it, is the totality of the psyche, everything conscious and unconscious, the full scope of who you are and who you have the potential to become. The ego is a small island in an ocean that is the self. And here is the problem. When the old identity collapses, the ego experiences this as existential emergency, because the ego is the identity. When the identity falls, the ego feels like it is dying, and the ego's response to this feeling is to rebuild as quickly as possible, to assert control, to construct a new identity, a new story, a new structure, anything to end the unbearable experience of not knowing who you are. This is the rebuild that looks like progress. The person who throws themselves into a new project, a new relationship, a new version of themselves with impressive speed and visible momentum. They seem to have their feet under them. They seem to have found their way through. But what they have actually done is allowed the ego to build a new house on the same cracked foundation. Slightly different design, same ground. The rebuild that holds is not built by the ego, it is built by the self. And the self cannot speak while the ego is frantically constructing. It can only be heard in the silence that the ego finds most threatening. The silence of the dissent. The silence of the void. The silence that feels like failure, but is actually the only condition under which genuine direction becomes available. Jung described this process as the ego learning to serve the self rather than replace it. The shift from a life organized around what the ego wants to protect and project to a life organized around what the self is actually trying to become. This shift cannot be forced, it cannot be scheduled, but it can be invited. By stopping the frantic construction long enough to ask a different question. Not, what should I build next? But what is trying to emerge here that has never had room before? The answer to that question is the only foundation worth building on, because it comes from somewhere the collapse cannot reach. It was there before the old self was built. It survived everything the old self went through, and it is the only thing that will still be standing the next time the ground shifts. You are not behind. You are not failing at recovery. You are not taking too long. You are not weak for still feeling the weight of what fell. You are in the descent, and the descent is not the obstacle to becoming who you are next. It is the process by which the next self becomes possible at all. The old self does not need to be erased. It does not need to be overcome or outrun or converted into a lesson as quickly as possible. It needs to be honored, fully, honestly, with the kind of grief that actually completes something rather than the kind of avoidance that carries it forward unfinished. And when that grief has been given its proper space, not forever, but fully, something will begin to emerge in you that no external collapse can produce and no external approval can confirm. A direction that comes from somewhere deeper than strategy. A sense of self that does not require an audience. A foundation that belongs to you in a way that nothing built from the outside ever could. This is what the ruins are for. Not to be cleared away as quickly as possible. Not to be rebuilt over before they have been understood. To be sat with, questioned, honored. Because inside every collapse is a correction. And inside every correction is the outline of the only version of you that was ever going to last. You did not lose yourself. You lost what was covering you. Write in the comments, I am building. If you are somewhere in this process right now, the descent, the grief, the silence, the first signs of something emerging, I want to know you are here. Because naming where you are is already the beginning of knowing who you are becoming. If something in this video moved you, there is more waiting for you on this channel. You do not need to know which video to watch next. Scroll through. Something will stop you. That is not algorithm. That is recognition. I will see you there.